Before we begin, I have something exciting for this holiday season. At Chroma, they have a special Black Friday discount, and use the discount code BFCM2025 for 21% off store-wide. BFCM2025 in the link I provide for 21% off store-wide. These are specialized lights designed for human biology. Check out their website, any product, and you can click on the descriptions and they will tell you exactly what this light does for human biology. They give great descriptions. And while you're there, check out their new product called Trinity. This is the so-called holy grail of light devices. So be sure to use BFCM2025 in the link provided. And also check out Daylight Computer Company. Daily. I use the DC-1, their computer. This is undisputed, the best and the future of technology. Use the DC-1 outside. You cannot believe how powerful and fun this thing is. And at night. Computers are overtaking our biology, and it is not a good situation. It's not just the algorithm, it's the artificial light, especially the blue light. That's a bad combination. With the DC-1, you don't have to worry about any of those. Use Autism as a discount code at checkout for a $50 savings. You can click on the link in the show notes. The future of technology is already here with Daylight Computer Company. For today's episode, we will talk all about audition. This will be an episode about autism and the auditory processes. We should begin in 1961 from von Békésy, who's a Nobel winner prize in physiology or medicine, and he was a biophysicist. In the spiral cochlea, it's a fluid-filled tunnel about the width of pencil lead, and sound does not simply just vibrate the entire structure uniformly. Instead, it generates a traveling wave along the basilar membrane, which is a 35 millimeter ribbon type that varies in stiffness from its base to its apex. High-frequency sounds, such as a whistle at 8,000 hertz, cause the waves to peak near the stiff, narrow base within 0.3 milliseconds of entering this oval window. Low-frequency sounds, like the deep bass drum at 100 hertz, travel the length to the peak at the floppy and the wide apex near the helicotrema. Now, I know, lots of dense and strange words here, but we're going to make it. This mechanical frequency, the separation, is a tonotopy. Motion is the first act of the auditory coding. At the wave's peak, thousands of little hair cells bend in unison, while outer hair cells, powered by electromotility, amplify the motion by up to 1,000-fold, while the inner hair cells transduce it into neural signals via glutamate, which remember is excitation, at a ribbon synapses onto type 1 spiral ganglion neurons. This is a lot, but we're going to parse this out into different kind of sections and understanding. This process occurs within 1 millisecond of sound onset. The striovascular, a 3-layered epithelial structure lining the lateral wall, is the underrated process, unknown process of hearing. This biological battery generates the plus 80 millivolt endocochlear potential. This is the highest DC voltage in the entire human body. This potential is not just a passive byproduct, but an actively maintained electrochemical gradient, essential for auditory sensitivity. The endolymph, that bathes in the hair cells contains 150 millimolar potassium ions and sits at plus 80 millivolts, while the perilymph has only 5 millimolar of potassium ion and is only plus 5 millivolts. Big contrast there. The hair cell interior rests at negative 70 millivolts, and thus a total driving force across the gradient is plus 150 millivolts, and this enables the potassium ion to rush through mechanically gated channels with explosive speed upon deflection. This ion influx depolarizes the inner hair cells and triggers a calcium-dependent glutamate. Remember, excitation release at this so-called ribbon synapses. There's lots of melanin here. The stria's marginal cells secrete the potassium ions in specific channels, and the intermediate cells, these so-called melanocytes that we're going to get into, buffer ions and provide antioxidant protection and transduction. And the basal cells pump out this potassium ion in a sodium-potassium chloride co-transporter. Remember the episode with Dr. Ezekiel Ben-Ari? He's talked about these so-called pumps in quite detail with the excitation and inhibition cells. This is what we're going to talk about a lot because, once again, the autistic phenotype is loaded with this excitation and inhibition mismatch, this imbalance. There's lots of melanin here in the stria vascularis. See, Jack Cruz on this. He really highlights this better than anybody, I think, with melanin's role in auditory processes. This is a bioelectrical gradient that powers hearing transduction, a place of semiconduction with little blood-brain barrier. So that means there's lots of water here. See, Decentralized Medicine 36 from Cruz's Patreon. Cruz's Patreon is probably the best $5 you can spend per month. Water is the key player here. It's a silent medium. Endolymph is 99% H2O. And this serves as both a solvent for the ion transport and hydraulic medium for the traveling wave. Without this water-based potassium ion, melanocyte stabilized 80 plus millivolts of bioelectrical gradient, there is no cochlear amplifier. There is no sound or wave transduction. There's no movement. There's no hearing, only silence. From the cochlea, the signal races up to the 8th cranial nerve as glutamate-driven action potentials by only 1.6 milliseconds. The distal 8th nerve generates auditory brainstem response wave 1. We have a little whiteboard series on auditory brainstem responses. Remember, wave 1 is the first wave. And this is recorded via EEGs on the scalp. By 2.7 milliseconds, the proximal nerve fires wave 2. And the first central synapse occurs in the cochlear nucleus, where bushy cells in the ventral division, the ventral cochlear nucleus, we mentioned this in the video, receive in-bulb of held inputs and phase lock them to sound cycles below 3 kilohertz. And this is preserving time differences. Meanwhile, during this process, the stellate cells, remember the star-shaped shells we talked about in mini-columns. They are only in layer 4 of the mini-columns. These are cells that are shaped like stars. These release GABA to create sideband inhibition and sharpen the frequency tuning. In the dorsal cochlear nucleus, fusiform cells integrate spectral cues, while cartwheel cells use GABA to suppress the echoes. GABA is inhibition. So we need this to suppress echoes. And this is the excitation-inhibition balance. This is where EI comes into play most notably. Glutamate drives forward. GABA carves clarity. Remember, the living organism, the human, our default is go. So the waves coming into the ear are wanting to go. It's the GABA that is used here to kind of channel them and help filter out any unwanted, unnecessary sounds. At the superior Olivary complex, and this is the first brainstem station for this binaural processing, this binaural hearing. The medial superior olive uses glutamate to detect from both ears to code the time differences with microsecond precision, while the lateral superior olive compares level differences via ipsilateral glutamate excitation, which means only one side, and contralateral glycine plus GABA inhibition from the medial nucleus of the trapezoid body, sometimes called MNTB. So glycine is something we haven't discussed that much of, or any. But this is acting as also extra inhibition. Glycine is sometimes inhibition. The calyx of Held, which is the largest synapses in the brain, ensures sub-millisecond timing. And this is all happening before 3.8 milliseconds. At 3.8 milliseconds, the auditory brainstem response wave 3 reflects this superior olive complex activity. And then the medial nucleus of the trapezoid body to the lateral superior olive pathway will co-release glycine, which is fast-acting, and GABA, which is more slower-acting, to shape and balance the excitatory and inhibitory profile, which is critical for sound localization and noise. When you speak, the brain activates the medial olivocochlear reflex via a corollary discharge from vocal motor areas. Corollary discharge is something in sensations, sensory neurons, sensory processes, that is providing some prediction. So your sensory organs can predict kind of what happens next. They can be on alert and be prepared. This is big with the superior colliculus to the frontal eye field as well for vision. The medial olivocochlear efferents release acetylcholine, and this is very fast acting, and GABA for more sustained inhibition. And this is hyperpolarizing them and reduces cochlear gain by 10 to 20 decibels. And this prevents self-deafening and allows you to hear others. The lateral olivocochlear system will activate during listening and use GABA to inhibit various dendrites and unmask speech transients and background noise. This efferent feedback is the first line of defense against listening dissonance. We'll parse out listening dissonance in a little bit. Upwards to the midbrain, the inferior colliculus, the auditory hub. Remember, inferior colliculus is to auditory as superior colliculus is to vision. These are relay stations. The inferior colliculus receives 95% of ascending fibers. In humans, one inferior colliculus contains approximately 13.5 million cells, and 40% of these are disc-shaped excitatory neurons. 9% of these are stellate cells, those star shapes, and 18% are GABAergic. Out of the 18% GABAergic, a majority of those are Parvalbumin interneurons. And then about half of many are somatostatin interneurons, and only roughly 2% of those are vasointestinal peptide, the VIP. And then the inferior colliculus also has about 30% glia cells. By 5.6 milliseconds, the ABR, Auditory Brainstem Response Wave 5, marks the first inferior colliculus spike, and it's specifically from the central nucleus of the inferior colliculus. Glutamate from the lateral lemniscus activate the noise, while GABAergic from local interneurons creates duration tuning. Sideband suppression, so background noise, and this EI response. High gamma oscillations of 70 to approximately 150 hertz emerge here. So typically, in sensory processing, gamma is risky, and a lot of autistic phenotypes live in gamma. But in hearing, gamma is required because high gamma oscillations reflect local computation. So we're in the midbrain. Remember the inferior colliculus, okay, the relay station for auditory. Remember the midbrain, the inferior colliculus, and the superior colliculus for vision. They are spatially relationship here. They can just reach out and high-five the thalamus. The medial geniculate body of the thalamus receives the auditory. This is the relay station for the thalamus, okay? So from the inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate nucleus, we're at 6 to upwards to 9 milliseconds. Myelinated axons of the inferior colliculus carry glutamate signals up. Remember, just to high-five each other. Diffusion tensor imaging, remember we've talked about this with sensory processing measurements and distal connection measurements. Diffusion is just nerd speak for movement. DTIs use a fractional anisotropy, or FA, and this measures 0.55 to 0.65 in neurotypicals, but a decrease in the autistic phenotype due to reduced myelination. The ventral division of the medial geniculate, remember, ventral is bottom or floor, basement type of thing. So it makes sense that inputs are going to come in here because the inferior colliculus is just below. So inputs are coming in and multisensory kind of begins. The thalamic reticular nucleus uses the GABAergic to sculpt out the thalamic output. Measurement instruments here reveal huge things about the autistic phenotype. Auditory brainstem response can use EEGs, and it shows the wave 5 delay in the autistic phenotype. MEGs captures reduced 40 hertz gamma. Remember, in auditory, you want gamma to be higher so you can help filter out because everything is so fast acting. You need a lot of power here. EEG tracks increased alpha effort. Event-related potentials show an increase in N400 mismatch. Remember, N400 means roughly at 400 milliseconds. So we're much downstream from here. But these measuring instruments are just kind of highlighting distal connections, the overall complete auditory processing. fMRI maps the medial prefrontal cortex hyperactivity. And the diffusion tensor imaging, that FA reveals a reduced white matter integrity in the inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate nucleus. So that's very close, but there's already a reduced white matter track right there. So in the neurotypicals, these systems are harmonized, and glutamate drives that, while GABA, the inhibition, sculpts out powers and unwanted noise. The auditory sector of the thalamic reticular nucleus, which is a thin GABAergic shell around the medial geniculate body, gates thalamic output and suppressing irrelevant frequencies. Remember the shell, that is the thalamic reticular nucleus. This is all inhibition and has crucial roles for sensory gating and modulating signal-to-noise control. The TRN here is suppressing irrelevant or steady background sounds while amplifying sudden or attended sounds. Noises that you want to hear, that you're sending your attention to. This is kind of assisting you with that. And this helps with selective attention as well. In auditory, the thalamic reticular nucleus is like noise-canceling headphones for all of the wild and uncontrollable background noise. From here, there's a kind of a system highlighted throughout various brainstem regions called the reticular activating system. And this spans the brainstem and the midbrain, which modulates arousal and attention to the sound. In hearing, norepinephrine and cholinergic inputs from the locus coeruleus and areas of the brainstem enhance inferior colliculus and auditory cortex 1, responding to alertness. So that leads us up to the thalamus. So from the cochlear all the way up to the brainstem, up the brainstem, and into the thalamus, we have the auditory brainstem response, ABR. This is something that's done as soon as you're born, within 1, 2, 3 days of life, before the baby even leaves the hospital to go home. You can do this. A recent study in 2021 by Delgado et al. Had a subjects of 139,154 newborns in Florida, only Florida. Every baby received routine universal newborn hearing screening with an automated ABR, auditory brainstem response. And years later, when preschool disability records were linked back to those specific subjects in the study, 321 children who received an autism diagnosis had already, on day 1, 2, or 3 of life, shown wave 5 latencies, prolonged by 0.3 to 0.5 milliseconds. Now, you might think, well, that's not that long. But remember, it only took us about 4 milliseconds from cochlear to the thalamus. Hearing is a very powerful and fast-acting process. That delay is so tiny, most clinicians wouldn't even notice it on a single tracing. But across hundreds of thousands of babies, it was unmistakable. There are no differences found in wave 1, so the periphery was fine. The problem was already central, already in the brainstem, already present before the child ever opened their eyes to the world or spoke their first words. And for the first time, there was proof that the auditory wiring differences in autism are prenatal, and that a test we had already given in newborns in many different countries at many different times can flag risk for the autistic phenotype and be an early biomarker. The reticular activating system alerts the living organism. The thalamic reticular nucleus filters out noise. And distal connections like the medial prefrontal cortex helps predict. In the autistic phenotype, a decrease of inhibition creates a noisy and effortful dissonance world, where something like porosity is lost. and noises pain, and triggers are threats. Sounds blend and so forth. So this leads us to listening dissonance. We mentioned this in the autistic phenotype and the adaptive responses episode about the medial prefrontal cortex. Listening dissonance is a very uncomfortable neural friction that arises when the brain expects a clear auditory signal, but it's receiving a mixture of target sounds and competing background noises. It is not a formal diagnostic term, but very descriptive and accurate. This moment-to-moment struggle of extracting meaningful, expected, and wanted sounds from the environment. This conflict begins in the cochlea, where loud noise saturates those outer hair cells and compresses the dynamic range and reduces the effectiveness of that plus 80 millivolt endocochlear potential that normally powers precise transduction. But as a result of this, faint cues are lost, and noises are masked and mismatched, and the auditory nerve fires less distinctively. Remember, I say that in noisy environments, or even if it's not that noisy, but there's just multiple sources of sound. Maybe the noises and sound is functional and it's at healthy ranges, but there are many of them. Sounds will start to blend and it'll start sounding like a late Beatles track, maybe something off of Sgt. Pepper's in 1967 or the White Album, 1968. They just began experimenting with different types of noises and instruments and then blending all of those together. They would do this later in the song, as the song ended, and it would just carry on and make these funky different noises. That's what listening dissonance is to me. By the time the signal reaches the brainstem, that superior Olivary complex in the inferior colliculus attempt to suppress the mask through sideband inhibition and the duration tuning. Remember, this is what GABA is trying to do. And remember, the autistic phenotype has low inhibition. If it's a seesaw, the excitation is on the high side of the seesaw. Inhibition is low, towards the ground. And this is a frequent phenomena with the autistic phenotype, where noise floods the central nucleus of the inferior colliculus, which is normally good for sharpening tunes and timing, is in a conundrum. It's a conflict. Lots of friction here. Remember, this is the auditory brainstem response wave 5. This is what's happening here with this abnormal wave 5. It's not the lack of hearing. It's not a hearing loss. It's hypersensitivity. It's blended noises. This is the big finding with the auditory brainstem response 5. Okay, so we made it up through the thalamus, and we're projecting out signals from the thalamus to things like the auditory cortex, and we mentioned the medial prefrontal cortex. So the auditory cortex is a so-called hallmark of dissonance, and this is where it becomes unmistakable. At 40 hertz, gamma rhythm that normally binds syllables together collapses, and phase locking weakens. Remember, we talked about phase locking in speech and language, or should be called language and speech. And the brain loses its ability to track the speech, sound, and envelope, the meaning. What should be a coherent stream is perceived as a jumble of disconnection and fragments. And to compensate, the brain recruits higher order regions. Frontal alpha power increases as a marker of heightened cognitive effort, while the beta oscillations reflect top-down predictions from the medial prefrontal cortex. And this attempts to fill the gaps. The anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, remember, which is a subdivision, a little nuclei of the medial prefrontal cortex. This monitors the rising prediction error. Remember, some of the roles with the ACC like error detection, conflict monitoring, evaluating risk-reward. And it is attempting to sustain activation of the dorsomedial and the ventromedial prefrontal cortexes. And this appears in fMRI, and it's kind of lit up. That effort-related glow will intensify with every decibel. The signal-to-noise ratio falls. In the neurotypical individual, this balanced network can restore partially and take back control, but they do show fatigue and even elevated cortisol, reduced things like working memory. In the autistic phenotype, the same noisy environment triggers an exaggerated form of dissonance, mainly because the Parvalbumin, positive GABAergic neurons, are reduced in the inferior colliculus and the superior olive, which is inhibitory sculpting that is weaker. Remember, this is the rows here as the signals are being sent up through the brainstem to the thalamus. The lemniscus pathway is already slower and less synchronous. So noise that a neurotypical listener finds merely effortful can become overwhelming, driving frontal alpha power even higher and often leading to sensory shutdown and incomplete or loss of control. At this time, particularly the belt regions projecting to the amygdala, the insula, and the orbital frontal cortex are hyperconnected. So the unresolved auditory signal spills into emotional circuitry. And a background hum or overlapping talker, this so-called sounds coming from the environment that are blending and are intensified, it's just not hard to understand. It can feel threatening or painful. I often have times where the ears are throbbing, it seems like. And a contribution to the higher rates of auditory hypersensitivity and misophonia is seen in autism. Ultimately, listening dissonance is the audible signature of an excitation-inhibition imbalance under load. And it explains why a classroom or a restaurant or family gatherings and so forth can be exhausting, intolerable for some or most. When the brainstem cannot adequately filter or the cortex can't provide top-down control, and all of this noise is just coming and coming and coming, and eventually you just can't take it. I often leave things like family gatherings and so forth. It's just too much. The signal to noise is sort of like the excitation inhibition. It's just too much of the bad kind. So let's move into the auditory cortex 1. The primary auditory cortex, sometimes called A1, is the first cortical station where raw acoustic energy is transformed into neural representations that we consciously perceive as sound. Remember the mini-columns. Remember the videos and the episodes about mini-columns. So let's build up a mini-column from the auditory cortex. Remember, each cortex, auditory, visual, cerebral cortex, and so forth, have different types of layers, mainly layer 4, where inputs are received. In layer 1, there are sparse, mostly feedback fibers. Layers 2 and 3 contains pyramidal neurons, sending association areas and contralateral information. This is just like we drew out in the whiteboard series. Lots of pyramidal neurons in layers 2 and 3. Remember, this is where consciousness and experiences and intelligence and so forth live in the living organism. Layer 4 has, in the auditory cortex, small stellate cells that receive direct thalamic input from the ventral medial geniculate body. The first cortical synapses that are roughly 12 to 16 milliseconds after sound perceived. Layers 5 and 6 have large pyramids projecting back to the thalamus, into the inferior colliculus, into the superior olive, and various regions of the cortex for feedback. The differences here, mainly with these different mini-columns and locations, is the layer 4. Stellate excitatory cells in layer 4 receive information from the medial geniculate nucleus that drive these local pyramids. Pyramidal excitatory cells in the layers 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 handle feed-forward to belt areas and perceive neuroplasticity. How are you going to respond? How is this living organism equipped for this input coming in? Parvalbumin interneurons are found in all layers of the auditory cortex, and this delivers fast GABA inhibition for that sharp tuning and gamma. So we have layers and layers of inhibition to help filter out noises at different epochs of the cochlear all the way up through the cortex and sensory perception, sensation perception process. Somatostatin interneuron, those other GABAs, cells are in layers 2 and 3 and also 5. This is providing inhibition at the dendrites and during duration of tuning. VIP cells, the vasointestinal peptides, the third kind of abundant cell type for inhibition, are found in layers 2 and 3. And this is providing disinhibition during attention. Remember, VIPs are disinhibition, which means stopping the stop signals. Inhibition of inhibition. A1 is where sounds stop being vibrations and waves and becomes perception. Remember layers 2 and 3. This is where our experiences and intelligence and memories and so forth live. This sound means this. X equals Y. These 6-layered gamma rhythmic gateways that turns the inferior colliculus's precise timing into rich and meaningful auditory world that we experience as individual living organisms. Everything higher in hearing, things like language, music, emotion, attention, is built on the foundation of A1 at about 50 milliseconds after sound reaches the cortex. Hearing is the most powerful thing happening in the human body. It's bioelectric, water-mediated, and excitation-inhibition kind of orchestra. From people like von Békésy's mechanical wave to auditory cortex 1, powered by the stria and all of those melanocytes and melanin, are shaped by GABA's ability to filter out, kind of channel out, while the go signals go, because there's a lot of go in hearing. With the autistic phenotype, the formula is easy. There's low GABA, low gamma, and high dissonance, and things like high misophonia. The formula is low inhibition plus high excitation equals sensory overload. So whenever you hear a parent say that their autistic child is in pain from the sound, that pain is probably real. Remember Katie Asher. She can be seen on the telepathy tapes, and she has her own podcast. She has books written about this. She is a very active person for the autistic phenotype. She said that her son, Houston, can hear Wi-Fi. And you should very much believe that. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge. and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586, where we can have discussions about autism, or neuroscience, neurobiology even. You can check out the YouTube channel for all shorts, links, and clips about the videos. And you can check out the new whiteboard series videos that I'm doing that attempt to kind of make this stuff easier to understand, because I know that episodes are dense, but I want people to understand the autistic phenotype, and I want to be able to teach it accurately. You can email me info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.